Okay, you should know the drill by now. Today we're talking about value. Hopefully you've watched the preceding videos. The last one was on texture, the one before that was shape, we had line, we had point. Now we're going to talk about value. Okay, so value refers to the relative lightness or darkness of a surface. Like in the previous videos, in the previous lectures, here's your page that has all of your vocabulary words on it. So anything that is bolded, it has a definition next to it, is fair game for our vocabulary quizzes. Again, I am not going to read these to you because you are in college and you can read, but here are your vocabulary words. Okay, a value scale visually displays a range of values, like the one that you see here that goes from very dark to very light. Value scales can also incorporate different kinds of mark making, like what you see here. So a little bit more complicated of a value scale in that we're looking at how different media, so we have our pencil or our pen, and also the different kinds of mark making. So it becomes like a useful reference for you when you are making work to be able to look back at your value scale and figure out what kind of mark making and what kind of media make the most sense for what you're working on. It's a reference piece, basically. Okay, so the word relative, when we talk about the relative lightness or darkness of something, when we're talking about value, is very important, okay? It's very significant. And this is an illustration of what we call relative value. So the value of a shape is largely determined by its surroundings. If you look at this image, each of the horizontal being like this, right? Each of the horizontal lines of squares are the same color. So the top that are all white, those are all the same color of white. The bottom that go across that are all kind of a dark gray, those are all the same color. So the one that's all the way to the right that looks darker and the one that's all the way to the left that look lighter, those are in fact the same shade of gray, but the one on the right looks darker because it has a lighter background, and the one on the left looks lighter because it has a darker background. So the background influences the way our eye sees color, or sees value particularly, but also sees color. We'll talk about that later. But so when you go through this thing, you can see that relative value is very dependent upon what the surroundings look like. And that's important to know when you're making artwork or designs, when you're making something visual. So this can also, other than just altering our perception of value, the background alters our perception of value, it can also impact things like communication and expression. So communication and expression are affected by value contrast, or that means the amount of difference in values is the value contrast, okay? High contrast generally increases our clarity and can improve readability, particularly if we're talking about words or something that people need to be able to read on, the text being one shade, one tone, and the background being another. If it's high contrast, if there's a high degree of difference, it's more clear and it's easier to read. And then, so if the value is similar, if it's low contrast, then it's harder to read, right? If any of you like Parks and Rec, one of my favorite shows of all time, Tom has his business, Entertainment 720, and he produces these business cards that are black text on a black background. He gives one to Andy, and Andy's like, I can't read what this says. And Tom's like, but it's the coolest of all time. It's black on black. Well, it is cool, but you can't read it, right? Okay, so that's an example of value contrast. Sorry, that was a tangent. Okay, so artists and designers are often use low contrast for shapes that are of secondary importance to make them not stand out as much, or when the message is supposed to be more subtle. So the same message can be dramatic and clear, or subtle and incoherent, depending on the amount of value contrast. So let's look into this with some other examples. Photographers, and I think at least a couple of you are photographers, I haven't read all of your intros yet, but photographers are definitely aware of the importance of contrast, right? When you're making photography, particularly black and white photography, it's very important. Contrast is one of the things, so like when you're, those of us who maybe aren't photographers in a traditional professional sense, but we're all kind of photographers to some degree now because we carry these cameras around in our pockets we call phones. Sorry, my cat is attacking. Ma'am? No. Sorry. Okay. So you have your phone with you, which has a camera on it. And one of the things, if you're like on Instagram or something, or TikTok or whatever, and you take a picture and you put a filter on it, one of the main things that is affected by a filter is the contrast, and that's part of what changes the way the image looks. So the high contrast in this photo, which is by Lewis Hines, who's a famous photographer from the 20s, gives it this kind of gritty immediacy, and it gives it the sense of drama, right? We have this very high contrast kind of look, which makes it seem more dramatic and a little bit more kind of intense, right? So it also increases the clarity because it has high contrast. So we can see every little piece of machinery, every little bolt on the machine. We can see the outlines of his musculature under his skin very clearly. It's very, very defined, right? So this is an example of high contrast. Okay, in contrast with that, let's compare this. So here's our high contrast and here's a low contrast image. So this is Alfred Stieglitz, or as I like to call him, Georgia O'Keeffe's husband. Georgia O'Keeffe's a very famous painter. Usually in art history, women who are artists get referred to as the wife of whomever their famous artist husband was, so I kind of like to flip the script on it. Anyway, he's a photographer, and this photo by him is called The Terminal. So in this photo, unlike the last photo we looked at by Hines, this one has a little bit more quiet. There's not the high contrast. You can't see, like here we see all these really crisp edges. We look at this one and everything seems a little softer, softer focus, right? And that's because this is low contrast. So we have the softer kind of vibe, and in comparison to the previous photo, which was very sharp. The low contrast appearance also makes it maybe a little bit warmer feeling, a little bit more inviting in some ways. It kind of pulls us back into this time when we're still in like horse and carriage time period. So it definitely affects not just the crispness, but also the emotional quality of the piece and the kind of overall feel of the piece, right? Okay, value gradation can also suggest a light source. It can also create a sense of three-dimensionality, and it can also enhance the illusion of space. So this work by Ray Burgraff kind of does all of those things in a very abstracted way. So here we can see that contrast and value contrast is also important when we're looking at something that is abstract and outside the realm of photography, as this is an acrylic painting on canvas. Okay, the next thing I want to talk about is value distribution, okay? So this refers to the proportion and the arrangement of lights and darks in a composition. So the proportion meaning how many highlights are there per shadows, for example. And the distribution, the other part of that is the arrangement. So like, are most of the highlights in the foreground, or are most of the highlights in the background, or the opposite of that? So a composition, for example, that is 80% black or very, very dark values has a different kind of feel than a composition that is like 80% highlights, or very, very light values, right? So as artists and designers, we use values to create a sense of mystery or increased dramatic tension. So we can use values not just to express the forms, but also to set an emotional kind of quality to what it is we're depicting. So let's look at this piece by Alice Leora Briggs. And here we see that she creates this kind of split scene. So we have the same scene from slightly different perspectives twice next to each other, which makes it a little bit interesting and dynamic in and of itself because it's sort of a strange composition. And here she uses the man who's in the foreground with his Starbucks, with his coffee cup there. She uses him kind of as the frame for what's happening in the background, right? So in the background, we have a crime scene investigation. It looks like it's a murder scene investigation. And the darker value in the background not only makes it recede or push back in space, so we understand that it is indeed the background, but it also kind of adds this feeling of mystery. There's something happening in the shadows, or something happening in the dark beyond this lighter foreground. Okay, lighter values tend to suggest, rather than dark kind of mystery like we were just looking at, lighter values tend to suggest clarity or optimism or hopefulness. And so we can look at this work in contrast to the work we were just looking at. It has sort of a similar kind of composition. Okay, so this piece is by Kevin Fletcher. So when we look at it, it kind of has the same vibe that's divided down the middle, right? You can kind of see compositionally how the balance is pretty similar and the value weights are similar but inverted. So when we look at this, we see that the composition again is divided down the center and that there's these kind of architectural elements on the sides that sort of frame it in the sides. So we have side framing here, division down the center here, division in the center, side framing, kind of similar. But in this image, we move from a darker foreground, the things in the foreground are much darker, to a much lighter background, which feels sort of hopeful and has sort of a liberating feeling. Like if you keep moving forward, and we have a lot of directional lines from the items in this space sort of pushing us like we're going to move in that direction. So if you move forward, you're moving from dark into light, right? So it has that kind of hopeful, liberating sort of vibe. As we move forward, traveling out of the darkness and onto the brighter light in the background. So it has a similar composition, but kind of the inverse of tone as the last work. Okay, so this is a slide that I use with my Drawing 1 class. We spend a lot of time working on modeling our objects. Modeling meaning that we're using value to make objects appear three-dimensional, not modeling like Christy Turlington. Christy Turlington, that's probably a very old reference for you. I don't know who the supermodels today are. There's something Hadid or one of the Kardashians. I don't know. Anyway, it doesn't mean modeling like a supermodel. It means making something look three-dimensional. Okay, so this is kind of more specific than sometimes we get into in 2D design, but I think it's important to know the names of things and to have a good technical breakdown. So we're going to go through this. When we use a full range of values, a two-dimensional shape can appear three-dimensional, and this is called modeling. Something two-dimensional appearing three-dimensional is also called volumetric, okay? So rather than saying, that looks three-dimensional, you can say, that is volumetric. So there's a new adjective for you. Let's take a little tour of this illustration. So when you're drawing something or rendering it using Photoshop or other Illustrator type programs or painting it, you want to understand how your full range of values lays out on an object, basically. So this is a handy slide to have. I'm just going to start at the top and go down. So we have what we call the center light. That's not the lightest part. Our lightest value is going to be the highlight. The highlight is almost never right at the top. It depends a little bit, obviously, on where your light source is, but one of the common mistakes I see is people have this problem where they draw what they think they know rather than what they see. One of my drawing professors when I was an undergrad said over and over and over to us, so that it stuck in my head forever, draw what you see, not what you know. So one of the things that people tend to do is just assume that the lightest highlight is at the very top of whatever they're drawing, and that's almost never the case. Usually the highlight is set down a little bit further in like it is here, and the center light, which is the area that is more directly towards the light source, tends to be not the primary, not the lightest value. Okay, so the highlight is the actual reflection of the light source, which isn't always visible if you have something really matte. Okay, so the material is also important here. The form light is the part of the object that receives the direct light. Okay, so the highlight is a reflection. The center light tends to be the lightest after the highlight because it is the closest in proximity to the light source. But the form light is the direct light, which tends to be the medium light value. Okay, the terminator, which is a fun word, this is basically the line that divides the light values from the dark values, so divides our highlights from our shadows. And then below that, we have reflected light, which makes the shadow brighten. It's a little lighter than the rest of the shadow because the light is bouncing off the surface, and that creates reflected light. Okay, let's go back up to the top over here. Halftones are the parts of the form light that are divided into the different levels, okay? So the halftones are a little darker than form light, and it's sort of a range of medium light grays, okay? The core shadow is, so we have the reflected light down at the bottom where the light bounces up from the surface, and as that loses strength, it creates the core shadow, which goes right around the terminator line. We then have the form shadow. So this is the part of the object that is in shadow. So if the light source is coming from here, we have our highlights and lights over here. The form shadow is on this side because it is not receiving the light directly, okay? And then we have the cast shadow. So this is the shadow that the object projects onto the ground. Within the cast shadow, we have the occlusion shadows. So this is where the surface of the object touches the surface of the table or whatever it's sitting on. So that's the occlusion shadow is the darkest part. That's the darkest value. And then we have the penumbra, which is the little kind of fuzzy, lighter shadow that kind of echoes the cast shadow. Okay, so those are all the parts of the values enumerated in a drawing. Let's look at a simpler drawing. Okay, so now that we have all the areas of value labeled, let's look at the transformation from a circle into a sphere. Okay, so we begin with a simple outline or a contour, if you remember from the line lecture, and then we add the attached shadows, which again, the attached shadows are going to be our core shadow, our form shadow, and our halftones are the shadows that are literally, they're called attached shadows because they're attached. They're on the surface of whatever we're drawing. Okay, so we add those to our circle to start to make it more three-dimensional. And they directly define, the shadows really directly define the basic form. So when we say attached shadow, that is something that's directly defining the basic form. We also have our highlights. So just to pop back over here really quick, we have our center light, we have our highlight, we have our form light, and we have our reflected light, right? So we have to round out not just with the attached shadows, but also the corresponding attached highlights, okay? The areas which round out everything, of course, we have then our cast shadow, right? So the cast shadow also includes the occlusion shadows, which is that darkest part that's right under the object, and then the penumbra, which is the kind of echo of the cast shadow. Okay, so the cast shadow grounds the sphere when it's drawn in contact with a plane. So when our object is touching the surface, touching the table, we have the cast shadow, and that grounds it and makes it seem more realistic, like it's actually taking up space sitting on a surface. When we want our object to look like it's floating, right, we create a separation between the cast shadow and the sphere, like you can see in this illustration, to the left, and that gives it the appearance of floating, of hovering, and not being in contact. Okay? Okay. That was a lot of information. So let's look at some applications. The transformation of shapes through value is so convincing sometimes that objects can appear to extend out from a two-dimensional surface. So, for example, this is not three-dimensional and sculptural. This is oil on panels. So this is a flat painting. This is, so the early Northern Renaissance oil painters often used grisaille, Grisaille, which is a technique that's basically using a gray underpainting before they would paint in color, before they would paint things in color. And then they would add the color. I talked about this a little in a previous lecture, but they would add the color in by doing a series of transparent glazes of oil paint on top of the underpainting. So in this piece by Jan van Eyck, he has created this image where it looks like we have basically a painting of two statues, and we have two people to the exterior who look like they're crouched down, kind of praying toward these statues. But what's nice about this image is the statues basically look the same as the gray underpainting would look. So like if we could look under the paint, the color paint of his kneeling figures, we'd have a similar kind of effect. And that's part of what lends the three-dimensionality to his forms. So I also have a contemporary demonstration for you. This is an oil painting in progress, so you can see we have the underdrawing, we have some tone put in, and then there's the gray grisaille work underneath, and then color is layered in on top of it. So you can kind of see how that works in effect, and here you can see the kind of relationship between those. But basically, particularly when working in oil paint, because you use glazing techniques, which are transparent layers that you build up and up and up and up, doing a underpainting in grayscale just to show the full values helps give dimension to your final piece. Okay, the next thing to think about is the relationship between value and space. Okay, so dark, crisp shapes that are high contrast, right, tend to advance spatially, and gray, blurry shapes tend to recede spatially. So here in Thomas Moran's wood engraving, we have the dark values that are more crisp are in the foreground, are closer toward us, and then they gradually sort of fade as we proceed backwards into the spatial picture plane until the cliffs in the background become kind of gray and indistinct. This effect in landscape painting is called atmospheric perspective. So that's like, and it's the same as if you're just a human standing out, you know, like if we were down in Arkansas on the Buffalo or something and we're looking down the river, the cliffs, the bluffs, as you look further in the distance, are less distinct than the ones close to us. That seems obvious, but for a long time in the history of art, painters would portray, or engravers, would portray everything as very, very crisp all the way back, and that doesn't feel as realistic, right? And that's because of the effect of atmospheric perspective. So the further away something is, the less distinct and the lower contrast in value we have. Okay? Let's see. Okay. Another technique that utilizes value in its execution is called Kiraskero, which in Italian just means light dark, literally. Okay, when we, I think it's when we were talking about line, we looked at a painting by Caravaggio. Caravaggio is a Baroque painter who is very highly associated with chiaroscuro as a technique, and also with tenebrism, which is chiaroscuro, but kind of in even a more extreme application. The other Baroque artist who is affiliated with this technique is Artemisia Gentileschi, and this is one of her works that we are looking at here in this slide. Basically, you have a primary light source, and often there's only one light source in these paintings that utilize chiaroscuro or tenebrism. And you use it to create a range of about 6 values. A very dark background is kind of one of the keys to the technique, and that is so that it increases the contrast so that the work is more dramatic. So in this work, the highlighted areas are clearly delineated. We can see the really highlighted areas. They really pop out of the work at us, right? And the resulting image is very dramatic. So what we have is, it's kind of a trick. Like, so if you want to create something that looks very dramatic like this piece, you kind of collapse your value scale to where your highlights and your darkest darks are right up against each other. You kind of butt them up right up against each other. And that really makes it pop. Like, look at this candle. So we have the darkest shadow kind of under her hand right there. And then we have our lightest point is this light source. And you can see how the very, very dark aspects of the painting are right next to the dark. So if we also look at her maidservant's headscarf, we have very, very light highlight up against very, very dark background. Okay, so that's kind of the trick to chiaroscuro or tenebrism. Okay, this leads us into value and lighting. So obviously people who do painting and drawing and engraving are very aware of value and of how it relates to lighting, but also filmmakers and photographers and designers have to be very aware of the expressive uses of value and the relationship between value and light. Right, that makes sense. So working with a wide range of lights, including sharply defined spotlights and more diffused floodlights, you can increase or decrease the illusion of space. You can emphasize an object or an action. You can influence our emotional response to a character. So there's all different kinds of things that you can do by adjusting the position of light to impact the value when you're working in photography or film. So this image demonstrates 4 common forms of lighting. And here we have the key light, so that's designated by key. The key light is the primary light source. So when you're working in photography or film, your key light is your primary light source. And then here you can see that they're supplementing with a backlight, with a fill light, and then the last image, they've taken away the key light completely and they're only lighting from the sides and the back. So you can see how that shifts the way the value spectrum, the value scale sits on this, on the model's face, right? So let's look at some of this in application. So director Michael Curtiz uses all of these aspects of lighting in the 1942 film Casablanca. So you can see the way lighting changes from scene to scene and how he is emphasizing different areas. So if we look at the top left, we can see Ilsa is very emphasized. She's the one who's in the light. We can see how her emotional state on her face is highlighted. In the lower right, we're also kind of looking at the emotional quality of the work. The foreground is definitely lit in a more prominent way. When in the upper right, when we're coming into Rick's bar, it's a little less dramatic. It's a little overall darker. We don't have the extreme highlights when we look to the left, right? So you can see in film how you can apply ideas about value and contrast to other media. Okay, so yes. So we can see how value has a wide range of application and impact across different media. And that is your value lecture. All right.